To Morning Report, a women's refuge study has found a strong link between domestic abuse and suicide. More than 1,200 women responded to the survey, and all reported they had considered or attempted taking their own lives. Women's Refuge head and jury is with me in the Wellington studio. Good morning.
Kia ora.
Kia ora, thanks for being with us. Now, the size of this, 1,200 responses, that in itself is pretty significant, both on a data front and the robustness, but also that's a lot of women getting in touch.
It is, and the number of responses surprised us.
Okay.
You know, we would have been thinking a half of that was going to give us a reasonable sample. Yeah.
And the outcome of that in itself, all of them reporting that they'd either considered taking their own life or had tried to.
Or self-harmed in some other ways, yes.
And so what does that say to you? What does that tell you?
It tells us that we need to pay a lot more, we all need to pay a lot more attention to what's going on for women after they reach out to services. You know, we assume that if we get them safe, then they're going to be okay. Well, what we saw in the survey was, no, not necessarily. You know,
What do you think are some of the reasons behind that? You get women safe, and why does that not fix the problem?
90% of those women had experienced other trauma in their lives, generally as children. So they were in a very vulnerable state anyway. Now, that doesn't go away overnight. Just because you get into a safe place, that emotional and psychological damage sits there. So I think we need to pay attention to that.
Is there also an element that there's more space for other trauma to resurface because they're no longer in a situation of domestic abuse?
Quite possibly, which means we also need to be really careful about how we respond when we hear those sorts of accounts. Yeah.
So now that you have this information, you're going to have to, I guess, treat everyone who walks through the doors of Women's Refuge differently. How are you going to have to do that?
We've tended to, we work with women who've experienced violence, women and children, and we've tended to focus on that. You know, that is our core business, that's what we do. And when women say to us, you know, tell us that that's what's going on for them, we'll make referrals and we'll deal with it. But if they don't, then we don't. So what we're going to need to do is actually grow our risk assessment process so that we're actually asking the questions.
Are you going to also, essentially in that initial contact phase, are you going to be treating people with that assumption that self-harm or suicide is very likely to be part of this picture?
We wouldn't want to make assumptions, but if we include that into our risk assessment processes, that will give us a guideline to how we're feeling. We're going to do some training as well to make sure that our responses are appropriate and that we don't do the same sort of blaming, shaming stuff as some other agencies. We haven't always got it right. I
was going to say there were some criticisms that came as a result of this situation. I think there was one certainly that was someone handed on the situation, informed an ex-partner's sister-in-law that they had gone to Women's Refuge and things like that. What are you going to do to address some of these criticisms that have come to light?
Exactly what I've said to you. We're going to be paying far more attention. We're going to be doing some training with our staff. That particular instance, we're not even sure what refuge it was. We've reached out to that respondent and said, look, hey, come talk to us. But we haven't heard back from her yet. You know, not all refuges are affiliated to NCIWR, so we're going to do our best. There's not an agency that came out of this unscathed. We had the police, we had the family court, we had OT, we had GPs, we had friends and family. Everybody got a bit of a caning, actually.
There was another criticism, I'll just read the quote to you. A lot of people weren't helpful. Women's Refuge turned me away so many times because they were full. I guess if you're full, you have to turn people away. But is there something else in that first sentence? A lot of people weren't helpful. How difficult is it for your workers on the front lines dealing with these inevitably awful situations, because that is what you're presented with. How difficult is it for them to remain resilient, to remain strong when faced with that day in, day out?
It's something that we recognise. You know, all our staff have regular supervision. We try and keep them as safe as we can. Most of our refuges have wellness leave so that we can actually decompress staff. It's not an easy job by any means. They do their best. When we have to turn women away from our safe houses, that's really hard. That's really, really hard. And that we never like doing that. Sometimes it is just a reality.
Appreciate your time. Thank you very much for coming into the studio as well. And
Thanks,
Jury
Susie.
there, head of Women's Refuge, at 16 minutes past 6.
Past 6.
It's past 8.
Past 8. Hey,
16 past 8.
Yeah, call it your maharara. No worries. 8:15. Families caring